Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know, we like to get into the nitty-gritty here on the deep dive, really dissect what's happening in the world. And one thing that just keeps popping up everywhere we look lately is layoffs.
Yeah, it's been inescapable. Every time you open the news, it seems like another company is announcing cuts.
Right.
Hmm.
And it's not just like small businesses feeling the pinch. We're talking major companies. IBM, Microsoft, even Qualcomm. These are big players. It makes you wonder what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Well, and what's really interesting here is that this isn't limited to just the tech world. We're seeing it across the board.
Hmm.
Pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, finance, even media and education are being impacted. It's pretty widespread.
Seriously, every time I refresh the news, bam, another industry's been hit. You mentioned pharmaceuticals, and I immediately think about all the Bay Area biotech companies. I feel like they've been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah, this past summer was rough on them, that's for sure. Gentech is a great example. They've had, get this, multiple rounds of layoffs, and it's not entirely clear why. Okay, so let's unpack that a bit, because Gentech is a pretty big deal in the biotech world. Multiple rounds of layoffs in 1 year, that's got to be a big deal. They must be giving some explanation.
Sure, their official statements have mentioned stuff about strategic resource allocation and future-focused pipelines, but, that's not very helpful for the people who are actually losing their jobs.
It's the classic corporate jargon. So, what's the real story? What did we find when we dug into this for our deep dive?
Well, some reports are connecting this to Genentech shutting down their cancer immunology research department. Seems like the research wasn't panning out the way they hoped it would, so they decided to cut their losses.
Wow, a whole research department down the drain and all the layoffs that come with that. That's intense.
And you can't forget that earlier this year, they announced they were shutting down their South San Francisco production facility, too. Hundreds of manufacturing jobs gone, just like that. So that's two major rounds of cuts impacting totally different parts of the company.
It's kind of like they're trying to play both sides, scaling back on manufacturing, but also saying, oh, we're laser focused on the future.
It's definitely a head scratcher. And, there are even whispers in the industry that some of this might be related to potential mergers or acquisitions.
Right.
But that's just speculation for now.
Ooh, corporate intrigue. So it might not even be about Gentech itself, but about these larger power plays happening in like the big bad pharmaceutical world.
It's totally possible. And it just highlights how interconnected these decisions are. Like what's happening at one company can be a symptom of a much larger trend.
Speaking of larger trends, this whole Gentech thing is making me think about what's going on with John Deere. They're laying off workers, moving some production to Mexico, and yet they're still pulling in record profits. It doesn't really add up.
The John Deere case is really interesting. I think it exposes this complex relationship between how corporations make decisions, politics, and, just how complicated this global economy is. Like, it's a microcosm of everything happening right now.
Right, because if you just look at it on the surface, it's illogical, right? Record profits, but they're still cutting jobs. It just makes you wonder where all that money is actually going if it's not going back to the workers.
Well, and this is where politics comes into play. Remember back when former President Trump was pushing for all those tariffs on goods from Mexico? He even specifically called out John Deere during his campaign for moving production south of the border.
Oh, yeah, that whole trade war era. It was supposed to protect American jobs, right?
That was the general idea. But fast forward to today, and Trump is saying that if he's elected again, he'll slap a 200% tariff on any John Deere equipment coming in from Mexico.
Whoa, 200%. That's huge. So now John Deere is in a tough spot. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place. It's like, who is actually looking out for the workers who are stuck in the middle of all this?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in all the high-level maneuvering, but at the heart of this issue are real people who are losing their livelihoods.
And we can't forget that it's not just happening at big-name companies like John Deere or Genentech. Remember all those stories about the East Orange School District? Budget cuts meant teachers were being laid off just before the holidays.
I know, those local stories really put things in perspective. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about real families, real communities, real lives being impacted by these decisions.
Absolutely. Those East Orange schools actually had to let students out early because of the cuts. I can't even imagine being a parent in that situation.
It shows how these big national trends we keep seeing, like in the WARN Act notices, can have very real consequences at a local level. And these notices, which companies are required by law to file when mass layoffs happen, well, they paint a pretty clear picture.
Okay, so For those who might not be familiar with the WARN Act, it tells us more than just the number of people being laid off, right?
Right. They break it down by the types of jobs, the locations, sometimes even the timeline of when the layoffs are expected. They're required by law, so they tend to cut through some of that corporate spin.
It's like getting a little peek behind the curtain. And speaking of peeking behind the curtain, can we talk about Intel? They've been conducting these massive layoffs, but here's the kicker. This is after they got billions of dollars in government funding and after announcing they were expanding.
Yeah, and that's a prime example of how, even within one company, seemingly contradictory things are happening at the same time. It's this complex web of factors at play.
Okay, so we've seen that layoffs are impacting pretty much every industry right now, and it's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom. But instead of panicking, maybe we can talk about what you, our listeners, can actually do to navigate this crazy job market.
Definitely. I always say knowledge is power, and that's especially true when it comes to your livelihood.
For sure. So let's get strategic. You mentioned the WARN Act notices earlier. How can those be helpful for, say, someone who isn't a CEO or a marketing analyst?
Well, think of them like an early warning system. By keeping an eye on those notices, you can start to get a feel for which companies or even whole industries might be heading for trouble.
So you can see the wave of layoffs coming, potentially, before it hits.
Exactly. There are websites like layoffs.fi that actually track all those notices and make the information really easy to find. It's like having a heads up about potential storms in the job market.
That is super useful. Okay, so let's say you're seeing those warning signs, or maybe you're just feeling a little uneasy about your job security in general. What's the most proactive thing you can do?
Well, besides staying informed, I'd say the most important thing is to constantly be upskilling.
Okay, upskilling. What does that mean exactly? Like taking a bunch of random online courses?
It's more than that. It's about being strategic. Identify the skills that are in high demand in your field or even in fields you might want to switch to, and then really focus on developing those skills.
So it's less about just collecting random skills and more about like strategically leveling up in a way that makes sense for where the job market is going.
Exactly. Like if you're a software engineer, are you keeping up with the latest programming languages? If you're in marketing, have you looked into data analytics or digital marketing certifications? The idea is to show potential employers that you're not just keeping up, you're ahead of the curve.
I like that. It's like those video game characters who are constantly leveling up their skills and abilities to stay ahead of the game.
Huh. Perfect analogy. And while we're on the topic of being proactive, don't underestimate the power of networking.
Networking, so important.
It's true. Building those genuine relationships within your industry, and even outside of it, can open up so many doors. You might discover opportunities that you didn't even know existed.
Networking is huge, and I think people sometimes have the wrong idea about it. It's not just about, schmoozing at industry events. It's about making those real connections.
Totally. And those connections can be super valuable, especially if you do find yourself facing a layoff.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's say, despite your best efforts, the worst happens and you lose your job. What are the immediate steps you should take?
First, take a deep breath and try not to panic.
Yeah.
I know, easier said than done when you're in that situation, but it's important.
Right. Don't spiral. It's easier said than done when your income suddenly disappears.
I get it. It's a blow to your confidence, for sure. But remember, it's just a bump in the road, not the end of the road. There are things you can do to regain control.
Okay, so don't panic. What else? What can you do to get back on your feet?
Well, one thing is to take advantage of the resources that are available to you. Many companies offer severance packages, and there are tons of workforce development agencies, both at the state and local level, that can help with job searching, training programs, even financial support while you're looking for a new job.
So reach out to those agencies, utilize those resources, don't be afraid to ask for help. And while you're at it, tap into that network you've been building.
Exactly. And, as tough as it is, a layoff can also be an opportunity.
An opportunity. In what way?
Well, it can be a chance to really reevaluate your career goals. Maybe this is the push you needed to finally make a change.
Like the universe is giving you this not so subtle nudge, like, hey, maybe it's time to rethink things. Sometimes we need that push, even if it comes in a really unpleasant package. Okay, so let's say you are thinking about making a change. What advice would you give to someone who's just been laid off and is starting their job search in this current climate?
I'd say you've got to stand out from the crowd. No more generic resumes and cover letters. You really need to tailor each application to the specific company and the specific job that you're applying for.
So do your research. Really understand what the company's needs are and showcase how your skills and experience can help them meet those needs. It's about showing them you're not just another applicant, but a potential solution to their problem.
Exactly. And when you land an interview, practice, practice, practice. Think about the questions they might ask you and have good answers ready, but also be yourself.
So be prepared, but let your personality shine through.
Yes. Genuine enthusiasm can go a long way.
That makes sense. But even with all the preparation in the world, job hunting can be brutal, especially when the market is this tight.
It can be a roller coaster, for sure. You're going to have good days and bad days. The important thing is to try to stay positive and focus on your goals.
Easier said than done sometimes. But yeah, persistence is key. Okay, so we've covered staying informed, upskilling, networking, the job search itself. But there's another big piece of the puzzle we haven't touched on yet: finances.
Ah, yes, finances. Often the most dreaded topic.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's crucial, especially when you're dealing with the uncertainty of layoffs.
Because even if you're the most skilled, most adaptable person out there, losing your job can really throw your finances into a tailspin, especially if you weren't prepared.
Absolutely. Having some kind of financial safety net is so important.
Okay, but how do you even begin to build that safety net, especially if you're living paycheck to paycheck? It feels impossible for so many people.
It's not as impossible as you might think. It starts with taking a hard look at your spending habits. Where can you cut back, even if it's just a little bit?
It's like making coffee at home instead of going to that fancy coffee shop every day.
There you go. Or packing your lunch a few times a week. Those small changes can really add up.
Oh, I totally agree. Those little expenses really sneak up on you.
And when it comes to saving, automate it. Set up an automatic transfer from your checking account to your savings account every month.
I love that. So you're not even tempted to spend it because it's out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. Even if it's just a small amount, the important thing is to make saving a regular habit. Consistency is key.
Small steps, consistency, automation. Got it. But what if, despite your best efforts, you still find yourself struggling financially after a job loss? Are there resources for people in that situation?
Absolutely. Don't be afraid or ashamed to look into government assistance programs like unemployment benefits or SNAP benefits. And definitely check out local charities or community organizations. They can be a huge help.
Yes. Pride should never be a barrier to getting the help you need, especially during tough times. Okay, so we've talked about practical steps for navigating the job market, managing your money. But let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, pivoting to a new career path. It's a buzzword these days, but what does it actually look like?
It's a hot topic for a reason. A lot of people are realizing they're just not fulfilled in their jobs anymore, or they're worried about job security, or maybe they just want to try something new. And, sometimes a layoff can be the thing that finally pushes them to make that change.
Right. Okay. But let's say you've been in the same industry for years, maybe even decades. How do you even begin to explore something completely different?
It starts with looking inward,
Mhm.
Take some time for some serious self-reflection. What are you passionate about? What are you naturally good at? What kind of work would give you a sense of purpose?
It's like that whole know thyself thing, but for your career.
Exactly. Once you have a better understanding of yourself and what you want, you can start exploring different career paths that align with those things.
That makes sense. So let's say you've done the self-reflection and you have an idea of what you might want to do. How do you actually go about exploring those options?
Talk to people.
Yeah.
Network with folks who are in those fields that you're curious about. Read books, read articles, take some online courses or workshops to get a taste of things. Don't be afraid to experiment.
So gather information, try things out, see what clicks for you.
Exactly. And remember, a career pivot doesn't have to be this drastic overnight transformation. It could be a gradual shift within your current industry, or it could be something totally different. The most important thing is to find what feels right for you.
Love that. Okay, so in this part, we've covered some really practical steps for navigating the job market, managing your finances, and even exploring a career pivot.
And I think throughout all of this, we've really emphasized the importance of being adaptable and resilient. This job market is changing so fast, and the only constant is change.
So true. So stay curious, stay informed, and stay ahead of the curve, right?
You can bet.
Don't forget to take care of yourself along the way.
Yes. Your mental and emotional well-being is just as important as your professional success.
100% agree. Make time for the things that bring you joy, whether that's spending time with loved ones, doing hobbies, or just relaxing and recharging.
Self-care is not selfish, especially during stressful times.
Okay, folks, we're going to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive on layoffs. But stick around because we're not done yet. In part 3, we're going to be tackling the bigger picture, those broader economic and societal implications of these layoff trends.
We'll be exploring some pretty big questions like, is this just a temporary blip, or is this a fundamental shift in the nature of work itself? What does all of this mean for the future of our economy and our society as a whole?
Big questions, indeed. So get those thinking caps back on, folks, because things are about to get really interesting. All right, deep divers, we're back. We've talked about navigating those choppy waters of this layoff wave, from practical tips to big picture career moves. But now I want to zoom out, like way out, look at the horizon. What do these layoff trends tell us about the bigger picture of the economy? Like, is this just a blip, a temporary storm, or are we seeing some, fundamental shift in how the working world just operates?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The billion-dollar question?
Yeah.
Economists, sociologists, everybody's trying to figure that out right now. We've seen companies, even those making record profits, use layoffs to
Right.
streamline, please the shareholders, that kind of thing. Makes you wonder, in this the new normal?
Right, because logically you'd think strong economy, more jobs,
Yeah.
right? Not fewer. So what's the disconnect?
Well, one factor that's definitely playing a role here is automation. As technology keeps advancing, machines, those algorithms, they're becoming capable of doing things that used to require, well, us.
So the robots are coming for our jobs. That sounds like a sci-fi movie, but it's happening now.
Yeah, it's not quite as dramatic as Hollywood might have you believe, but it's definitely happening. And it's not just those, stereotypical factory jobs either. We're seeing automation in finance, law, even medicine fields people used to think were untouchable.
Wow. Okay, so if no job is safe from this robot revolution, what's the game plan? What can people do to make sure they're ahead of the curve?
I think this is where it becomes even more important to focus on those skills that are uniquely human, creativity, critical thinking, complex problem solving, emotional intelligence. Those are the things that machines, at least for now, can't really replicate.
Like we're playing this constant game of leapfrog with technology. We have to keep jumping ahead, learning new skills, new ways to be valuable.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But it's not just about outsmarting the machines.
Yeah.
There's another force at play here that's a little more uncomfortable to talk about, maybe, and that's corporate greed.
Okay, let's unpack that. Corporate greed. What does that look like in action, especially in the context of all these layoffs?
Well, in a lot of these cases, these layoffs, they are driven by absolute necessity. They're about squeezing out every last drop of profit for shareholders, even if it means cutting jobs that, at least on paper, seem totally secure. It's like profits over people, even when the company's already doing really well.
It's like squeezing a sponge. Even when you've already wrung out all the water, you keep squeezing, even though the sponge is about to rip.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that raises questions about what the role of a company is in society. Like, if a company is a well-oiled machine, shouldn't the people who are part of that machine be valued, rewarded?
Absolutely. Especially when they're the ones, helping to create those record profits. There's definitely a disconnect there.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And this debate's been going on for a while, but it feels more critical now than ever, given the sheer scale of these layoffs, how they impact communities, families, the whole economy, really.
It's not just about those individuals who are losing their jobs either, right? It's that ripple effect. Less spending power in the economy, more strain on social services, increased inequality.
Exactly. So, yeah, we've been talking about individual strategies, how to navigate this job market, and that's all important. But we also need to be talking about the bigger picture stuff, corporate responsibility, fair labor practices, government policies that actually help workers, not just profits.
Yeah, creating a system that's sustainable for everybody, not just those at the top. Okay, so we've got automation changing how we work, maybe some corporate greed influencing how many people get to work. Any other major factors we need to be aware of in this whole evolving landscape of work?
One that I think often gets overlooked is globalization. As companies become more global, they can and do move jobs to places where labor is cheaper.
So even if your job isn't, taken over by a robot, it might be moved overseas to save the company money. It's like a whole other level of competition.
It's true. And this trend's been happening for decades, but it's definitely accelerating now with all these emerging economies. It gets complicated quickly, too, because now you're talking about trade policy, labor standards, even the role of government and how to regulate a globalized economy.
It's like we're all pawns in some giant game of chess, but instead of pawns, we're talking about people's livelihoods. So, with all that in mind, where does this leave us? What does the future of work even look like?
I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I really don't. While some jobs are definitely going to be lost to automation, other jobs are going to be created. I think the key takeaway is adaptability, being willing to learn new skills, new ways of working.
So, not man versus machine, but man and machine working together.
Exactly. And we're already seeing this happening in fields like medicine, for example, where they use AI to analyze those medical images. Human doctors are still essential, of course, for diagnosis and treatment planning, but it's all about using technology to enhance our capabilities, not replace us completely.
Now that's a more optimistic outlook. So, what can our listeners do? Like, for those who might be feeling a little overwhelmed with all this change, what can they do now to prepare for this future of work?
It's all about those core principles. No matter what your job or your industry, stay curious, stay informed, never stop learning and growing, keep networking, building those relationships, and be open to new opportunities, even if they're a little outside your comfort zone.
It's about being proactive, taking control of your career path, not just waiting to see what happens.
I like that.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into layoffs, the future of work, everything, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say don't forget the future of work isn't set in stone. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make, the conversations we have, even the policies we support. So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay adaptable. The future really does belong to those who are willing to roll with those changes, even create their own opportunities.
It's such a powerful message. A huge thank you to you, our expert, for breaking down this super complex topic with so much clarity and insight. And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, knowledge is power, especially now. Until next time, stay curious out there.